This is the Unique Scotland podcast with exclusive ScottishVisits.co.uk.
Hello, this is John Harbour and welcome to Unique Scotland, the podcast from my website exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk. I'm back in Scotland this week, having travelled back from London last Tuesday, and I was lucky to have been able to see my southern friends when I did because our Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, has just declared a full lockdown again in England, which would have meant either not travelling or being stuck in London for a month, not a prospect that I would have relished. Well, today in Scotland the weather is calm after a couple of days of storm. I actually went live on my exclusive Scottish Visits Facebook page yesterday, and if you log into my Facebook page you can see how bad the weather was. It was absolutely bucketing rain. Why would I do that? Well, I like to broadcast live over the weekend when most folk are around to catch the live stream, and you can actually see the rain dripping off me, and to say that I looked like a drowned rat is an understatement. Well, this is the fourth and final part of my Inverness to Gairloch and Return podcast, and last week we just left the lovely house and gardens of Gruinard House. I promised on that occasion to give you some good news of the area and some not so good news. Well, Gruinard House and Gardens was the good news, and in this podcast I will share with you that not so good news. So shortly we'll continue on our way towards Gairloch and onto the fabulous white sands of Gairloch Beach, which is also part of the North Coast 500, and come back via Loch Maree, which Queen Victoria visited in 1877. Then we'll continue on to Inverness. I do feel blessed to have travelled to all the places that I talk about, and if you'd like to see more of my visits, by all means visit my website www.exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk. You can also catch the videos that I've shot on my YouTube channel under Exclusive Scottish Visits. Well, it's time to return to our journey along this coastal route and hear of the wonderful coastal road of the Wester Ross area. So, I'd now like you to relax wherever you are and thoroughly enjoy this fourth part of your Unique Scotland tour from Inverness to the Gairloch and back. Take time out for the next 30 minutes or so to enjoy a virtual journey through Scotland's west coast. When we leave Gruinard House and Gardens on the narrow single-track road, we come back onto the A832 and turn left heading southwest towards Gairloch. The road is dual-track but still narrow and is hemmed in by forestry on the left and a line of trees on the right with some sheep farming land beyond. It's not long until the road bends round towards the coast once more and Gruinard Bay comes into view. There's a large parking area on our left-hand side and access to the beach is across the road, through a small wooden turnstile and down some wooden steps. It's nice to take a stroll along this relatively narrow white sandy beach, and it's not long before I arrive at the water's edge. It's on arrival here that I look out onto Gruinard Bay and am reminded of the not-so-good news that I mentioned in my previous podcast. What I can see from this spot is an island called Gruinard Island. Sadly, it also has the moniker of Anthrax Island, and it's quite a story to tell in such a beautiful part of the world. The island is approximately 1.25 miles long by half a mile wide, and is about half a mile offshore. The island is actually mentioned by a Dean Munro who travelled to the area in the mid-16th century. He wrote that it's Clan Mackenzie territory. It was full of woods and it was good for fostering of thieves and rebels, meaning that it was a great hiding place for thieves and rebels. Today the place is treeless and has been uninhabited since 1920, although there were 6 people living here in 1881. The island became famous, or infamous, after the Second World War as a place not to visit after the Ministry of Defence closed it to the public. In 1942, biological warfare tests were being conducted at the Biology Department of Portendown, which is still used by the Ministry of Defence today. It is now called the Ministry of Defence's Science and Technology Laboratory and employs some of the country's top scientists who carry out research into the world's most dangerous pathogens. Indeed, Portendown became involved in identifying the poison that nearly killed the Skripals, the Russian spy and his daughter, in the Russian government chemical agent Novichok attack in Salisbury. Anyway, before I digress too much, when the British government during the Second World War wished to investigate the feasibility of producing biological weapons, they chose Gruinard Island as the place to do the tests. They realised that the tests would cause long-lasting contamination of the immediate area by anthrax spores, so a remote uninhabited island was required. And that's where Gruinard Island comes in. Under the rather absurd name of Operation Vegetarian, scientists and about 50 personnel organised 80 sheep to be taken to the island, and bombs filled with anthrax were exploded near to them. Well, the results were very positive for science, but not for the sheep, who all met their maker. After the tests, scientists concluded that a large release of anthrax spores would thoroughly pollute German cities, rendering them uninhabitable for decades. Now, I have to balance this story with the fact that the Germans had already manufactured similar weapons that were being used in their own style of warfare. After the war, Gruinard Island remained quarantined for nearly 48 years, and it wasn't until 1986 that a concerted effort was made to decontaminate the island. After a huge operation to remove all traces of the anthrax, the quarantine was lifted. On the 1st of May 1990, the island was repurchased by the heirs of the original owner for the original sale price of £500, and the island is now considered safe to visit. So, a not-so-good news event, but it does have a happy ending. I'm not sure the owners are going to open it up to the public anytime soon, however. Of course, I could have said nothing at all about this piece of World War II history, especially now that it's fixed, but this whole area is connected in some way with World War II, and I'm going to give you a little more as we work our way along the coast. Indeed, as we continue our way along the coast, we actually come to a number of small settlements, the first of which is called Second Coast. The second settlement is called First Coast, and before we pass through Sand and Lade. And when I say small settlements of the past, well, if you blink you miss them. Having said that, First Coast almost became famous for the discovery in 2014 by a university student, a hut circle, which in archaeological terms is a circular or oval depression in the ground with evidence of a low stone wall around it. Effectively, it's the foundations of Neolithic man's dwelling. It's about 4,000 years old, and the superstructure would have been made of timber and thatch. But as we continue on, the road bends round to the left towards Altbea. If you look at a map, you will see there's a road that goes straight on, and when I drive in this area, I usually take time to go straight ahead onto the peninsula with Greenstone Point at the end. If there's time, there are some lovely, out-of-the-way sandy beaches in this area, and I sometimes have a picnic at Melon Adrigal Beach, which is a charming outlook across the bay to the Summer Isles. Anyway, we are winding our way around to Altbea, and, as I've mentioned before, this area played an important part in the Second World War. And sure enough, just before we enter Altbea, on the right-hand side is a building housing the Russian Arctic Convoy Museum. It's fascinating, and I'd recommend a visit when you're in the area. A little more on why there's a Russian Arctic Convoy Museum shortly. We turn right off the single-track road, where the view opens up once more onto a fabulous bay called Loch Ewe, and there is the village of Altbea. Altbea has wonderful views out to Cove and the island of Lewis in the distance, as well as the nearby Torridon Mountains. It's a small fishing village situated on the shores of Loch Ewe. Population about 500, and when I entered I saw that there was a small primary school and 2 hotels. The last time I visited, I looked forward to a bite to eat, a nice coffee and a seat in the conservatory looking out onto the bay. Bliss. However, both hotels were closed, which took me aback somewhat considering the beauty of the area and how wonderful it would be to stay locally. Well, I did a bit of digging and discovered a wee scandal about the Altbea Hotel. It appears that in April 2019, when guests were staying at the hotel, one of the staff who was doing the breakfast shift received a phone call from the owner to say, in simple terms, he wasn't coming back, and the staff were to inform the clients staying at the hotel to find somewhere else to stay. It appears that the owner took off in the night, although he did have the decency to phone in the morning to give instructions to move the guests on and tell the staff to close the hotel. A former employee who was quoted in the local Free Press stated that he had come into work as normal for the breakfast shift, only to find that the owner David Shalom had left the hotel and it would be closing. It would also appear that mystery surrounds the whereabouts of the hotelier, and today the hotel is up for sale. According to the Free Press, the Altbea Hotel is registered under the company name View Hotels, and Mr. Shalom is a director. Well, I looked at a post on the Visit Wester Ross Facebook page from the time, and it read, "Important notice. We understand that the Altbea Hotel appears to have suddenly closed without warning. A notice has appeared on the door to that effect. Their Facebook page has stopped, and the owners have reportedly left the area." It's understood from local sources that the hotel is up for sale, but cannot be sold for legal reasons. I asked the local if she knew anything about the situation and how long had the hotel been closed.
It's been closed for, must be over a year now, probably. I think the banks kind of technically own it. The owner did a runner.
Ah.
Yeah. So nobody really knows where he is, and nobody's been able to buy it because they need the owner to sign something, is my understanding.
So, a complete mystery, and even today we're not sure exactly what's going on, but watch the space. There may be a nice little hotel for about £500,000 going for sale in Altbea in the not too distant future. Sorry, I went off on a tangent there, but I just wanted to share some of the shenanigans in this podcast, as well as the beauty. And there is beauty aplenty, with fabulous sandy beaches, as well as rocky shores, and as you look across Loch Ewe, you will see an island called, believe it or not, the Island or Isle of Ewe. I always have fun with couples when I'm standing looking out across the bay at the island. I'll ask the couple to stand side by side, show them the map with the name of the island, and ask them to say the name to each other. Of course, they think nothing of it and say, "I love you," and when I reply, "I love you too," they smile. Scattered around the area are the remains of World War II buildings and barracks. If you go to the local football pitch, there's a display board which describes the role of the buildings in detail, and it's not uncommon on beaches around the United Kingdom to find old concrete anti-tank defences, and in fields nearby the old bunkers that would have housed defending troops from the threat of invasion. But there are so many in the local area here, in Altbea, because Altbea was so important to the war effort. It's hard to imagine this beautiful loch in Wester Ross was used to such an extent in the Second World War, but it actually has a natural deep water harbour. That linked directly to the Atlantic Ocean via a relatively narrow mouth which made it easier to defend against the danger of enemy submarines. There was also heavy anti-aircraft batteries that were seldom troubled by enemy aircraft other than perhaps the odd reconnaissance plane. Well, in February 1941, the loch became an Atlantic and Russian convoy collecting point, and remained so throughout the war. And this is where the famous Arctic convoys, or PQ convoys as they were called, left from, to take vital supplies to Murmansk and Archangel in Russia, who were struggling themselves in a war against Germany. PQ was the code name for the convoys, and if you want to read a fascinating book about the extreme hardships and real-life drama at sea during World War II, then I do recommend the book PQ-17, which suffered the most losses to German aircraft, submarines and German battleships during that time. You can tell that I'm a retired naval officer. I do love a good maritime book, and I have to say a huge thank you to a previous guest who travelled through Scotland with me, Gary and Susan Sheeb, who know of my love of naval history, and sent me another excellent book on PQ-17 called The Ghost Ships of Archangel, and that was written by William Giroux, which talks specifically about the PQ-17 and brings to light the heroics of that convoy. The last convoy sailed from Loch Ewe on 30th of December 1944. Altogether 481 merchant ships and over 100 naval escort vessels left Loch Ewe for Russia in a total of 19 convoys. Many never made it back. Today Loch Ewe still has a naval presence with a NATO fuel station nearby, and you can see the huge fuel tanks on the hill above a long jetty jutting out into the sea for NATO warships to arrive and refuel. There are still a lot of old buildings overlooking Loch Ewe, and a memorial with the inscription on one says the following: "In memory of our shipmates who sailed from Loch Ewe during World War II. They lost their lives in the bitter Arctic sea battles to North Russia and never returned to this tranquil anchorage. We will always remember them." And it's rather poignant that I'm reading this epitaph and recording this episode on Remembrance Sunday. So if you are ever visiting this area and enjoying the incredible beauty of the mountains, beaches and clear blue sea, just pause a while and give a thought to the part that Altbea played in protecting our democratic freedoms. Well, as we leave Altbea and head south towards Gairloch, there is one place to stop and allow nature to take away all your cares, and that is INVEREWE Garden near Pollue. I've talked previously about the Gulf Stream, which comes up the west coast of the United Kingdom, and the warming effect it has on the waters of the west coast of Scotland. Well, INVEREWE, which is well sheltered at the southern end of Loch Ewe, takes advantage of the Gulf Stream. As you will recall from previous podcasts, the word Inver means at the mouth of, and in this case it's at the mouth of the River Ewe, which, as it happens, is one of the shortest rivers in Scotland. INVEREWE is a botanical garden and is noted for the breadth of its collection. The land on which it was created was a barren wilderness on the Atlantic coast in the Northwest Highlands, and in 1862 a gentleman named Osgood Mackenzie took his 2,200-acre estate and turned it into an amazing garden against the challenges of a windy west coast and poor soil. To solve this, he planted a mixture of large trees to act as a windbreak, such as Corsican pine, Douglas fir and rhododendrons. He then set about planting as many exotic plants as possible until his death in 1922. The garden covers some 50 acres and today has some 2,500 exotic plants and flowers. The garden seems to have been created from experimentation, and the colour, scents have been cultivated with care and a hefty dose of creativity. You may even enjoy a glimpse of some of the wildlife in the garden, and there's red squirrel, red deer, seals on the shore, and you might even see a seagull fishing on the loch. There's also a lovely walled garden filled with exotic plants that come into their own in the summer. Even in the winter, INVEREWE is colourful, as the bark of many rhododendra are beautifully and delicately coloured, and the collection of native and non-native trees, including woolemi trees, add to the variety. And a real treat are the huge Californian redwoods that tower above the gardens. After Osgood's death, his family kept the garden going until 1952. His daughter, Mary Sawyer, handed the garden over to the National Trust for Scotland, who still manage it today. The garden continues to be developed by the small team of 10 gardeners, and it's lovely to wander around the garden with Loch Ewe on one side and a beautifully terraced garden on the other. It's amazing what can be grown in one of the most northerly corners of Scotland when you put your mind to it. It's a real treat to meander through a garden in this remote stretch of coastline and enjoy a wonderful array of both local and unusual exotic plants. And you do get the feeling that this was built out of love and an enduring commitment, and it's a must visit if you're in the area. While continuing southwest on our journey, we quickly arrive at the small village of Pollue, which is situated at the sheltered south side of Loch Ewe. With a population of about 300, it's a neat and very attractive village, with a stunning location and one of the reasons that it gets so many visitors in the summer. It comprises a main street of largely white painted buildings, and it's also home to a beautiful Episcopalian church, St Melruva's. It stands a little back from the main road and is a low single-storey building whose walls are supported by massive buttresses. It gives the impression of a medieval or a Celtic church which has survived over the centuries. After all, St Melruva was an Irish monk who founded a monastery further south at Applecross in the 7th century. Well, an old building it may be, but the church itself was only opened in 1965. The most obvious clue that it's not an ancient church is that its alignment is roughly north-south, whereas early church builders would have generally built an east-west alignment, and you can see that today in most church buildings and cathedrals. As it happens, the people of Pollue used to worship in the village hall or the Gairloch Hotel, but in the early 1960s, Major and Mrs. Buchanan MacDonald gifted an existing old byre to the community, and work began on a rebuild to a design inspired by early Celtic churches. Well, leaving Poolew behind, we continue for another 5 miles and finally reach the furthest point of our journey at Gairloch, and are presented with a superb view of Loch Gairloch and a huge expanse of golden sands. In the centre of the village of Gairloch, I found the Gale Centre, where I met a young lady called Louise, who told me a little bit about Gairloch.
Gairloch's got a few pubs and cafes, and we've got the Gairloch Museum, which won Museum of the Year recently.
Wow.
Which is really cool, and that's just next door to us. Obviously, the Gale Centre, where I am just now, is got a community shop and a community cafe. Again, there's lots of nice beaches, lots of good walks. There's like a harbour as well, so there's boat trips that run from there.
Yeah, I've actually been to Gairloch Beach. It's absolutely lovely.
Yeah, it's a lovely beach. Really nice.
And that was Louise telling us just a little bit about what Gairloch has to offer. And when I visited last, I stopped at the grocery store for a lunchtime sandwich, and even here the effect of COVID, sadly, was being felt as I stood in a queue of 3 people outside the shop, as only 4 people were being allowed into the narrow-aisled grocery store at the time. However, in the Highlands you will come across Highland hospitality, and Gairloch's store was no exception. A young lady in the store came outside to help and took my order, went back inside. When the queue reduced and I found myself at the front, my goods were ready for me just to pay. Lovely touch and very efficient. Well, now it was time to go down onto the beach and enjoy the sandwich. I walked away from the village and descended onto the beach from the quiet road not far from the Gairloch Hotel. It was sublime. At the top of the beach were pebbles, and I put down my jacket for somewhere to sit. Just beyond me was a patch of broken shells, a shingly mark on the shore indicating the high tide mark, but beyond, stretching for what seemed like miles, was a beautiful sandy beach leading down to the blue water of Loch Gairloch and the open sea beyond. Now, I can think of nothing better than enjoying fresh sandwiches, some smoked ham and cheese, by the way, a cool drink and some chocolate snacks on a fabulous beach looking out to sea, with the outline of the Trotternish Ridge on the Isle of Skye in the distance. The amazing thing is that I had this entire stretch of fabulous beach to myself. Actually, a young couple came onto the beach later with a dog, and it was fascinating to watch it having the time of its life, dashing in and out of the water to retrieve the ball that was being thrown by its owners. But that was it. Miles of beach, and it was all mine. Well, after an hour of sheer bliss, we must leave this tranquillity and move on now southeast back towards Inverness. As we head south, the road is dual track, but still narrow. Either side is a shallow bank of silver birch trees with ferns, gorse and wild rhododendra at the side of the road. Ahead we are starting to see the Torridon Mountains, and Bel Alligan at over 3,000 feet is just visible. After 6 or 7 miles of driving, we start to see, through the short fir trees on the left, the wonderful Loch Maree. The loch's 13.5 miles long, with a maximum width of about 2.5 miles, and is the 4th largest freshwater loch in Scotland. Its outflow to the sea, actually, is the River Ewe that I mentioned earlier, and the loch itself contains 5 large wooded islands and over 60 smaller ones. The largest island, Eilean Savain, contains a loch that itself contains an island, a situation that occurs nowhere else in Great Britain. This Island of Maree holds the remains of an 8th century chapel, believed to be the hermitage of St Melruva, who I mentioned before, and who founded the monastery of Applecross in the 7th century. The loch actually gets its name from the saint. Now, the islands of Loch Maree are the location of some of the best native Caledonia pinewood in Scotland, an original species that has been considerably depleted, and the islands are now protected by conservation designations. The most prominent mountain on the northern side of Loch Maree is Sleoch, one of Scotland's Munros, which dominates the eastern end of the loch above Kinloch Ewe. Queen Victoria visited the area in 1877 when the royal party travelled from Balmoral back to London. She arrived by train and stayed at the Loch Maree Hotel for 6 nights, which still bears the royal crest above the door, and it's worth stopping just to have a look at it. Not far from the hotel is a waterfall with a viewing platform which is named Victoria Falls, and that was after the Queen visited this site. Due to its remote location, there is now little industry surrounding Loch Maree. However, in the 17th century it would have been throbbing, as it was an area for ironworking. Hundreds of hectares of oak woodland was turned into charcoal to fuel the smelting of bog iron. There was no iron ore in the vicinity, but it was clearly more cost-effective to bring the iron ore to a site of fuel rather than the other way round. And back to the 21st century, sea trout and salmon can be found in the loch and provide food for the other wildlife, such as the black-throated diver and otter. There are some wonderful viewing points along the loch, and it's very relaxing to spend some time in reflection in this quiet spot before continuing on. Well, our next stop is Achnasheen, a tiny settlement of just 28 people, but I'm always surprised just how many people have heard of it. Perhaps it's the romantic-sounding Scottish name, Achnasheen, but I suppose it's also been an important junction in the centre of the Northern Highlands for hundreds of years, where, for example, old cattle droving roads would join. It's here that the road from Inverness splits in two. Either head west and you pass Loch Ewe en route to Ewe and Gairloch, and that's the one we've just come from, or turn south and you're on the road to Loch Carron and the Kyle of Loch Alsh, or the road to Skye. I will talk about Loch Carron in a future podcast, and we will visit Lady Laird Joanna Macpherson, who owns INVEREWE Gardens, another beautiful oasis of tranquility in an exquisite garden. Achnasheen's name comes from the Gaelic for Field of the Storms, which is probably appropriate as it sits at a height of around 500 feet with little shelter of any kind. In Achnasheen today there's a post office, and people sometimes buy postcards to post there and obtain the postmark of Achnasheen. In the village there's a studio gallery, a cafe, and it's a regular stopping off point for coach tours of Wester Ross, and there's also a bunkhouse for walkers and other travellers on a budget. Well, we get back on the road and drive about 6 miles when we come to the tiny village of Achenalt. I stop here because there's a brown tourist sign that directs visitors up a steep grassy path to the graveyard at Knocknavine. Here you find the grave of Captain Bertram Dixon, a pioneer of military aviation in the years before the First World War. And it's a lovely tribute to an aircraft pioneer, and occasionally it's amazing to see modern military aircraft practicing low-level flying down the valley, dipping their wings as they pass this spot. About 10 miles later, we arrive at the crossroads of Garvey, where, in the last podcast, we took the junction to the north, having driven from Inverness, and that is where our journey ends. I often say to visitors in my car when we have been on a day's tour, and we then retrace our steps, that what you saw on the way here is exactly the same on the way back, except it's on the other side of the car. If you did miss the last episode, then please do listen to catch up as to what we did see on the other side of the car. Well, it's only half an hour back to Inverness, where a comfortable accommodation awaits and a splendid dinner at the Mustard Seat. I do hope you've enjoyed this fourth and last part of our journey from Inverness to the Gairloch and back. I feel that I've digressed a little too much sometimes, but I find the World War II connection of the West Coast is fascinating, and few people realise, as they drive around the incredible beauty of the area, the enormous military contribution made during the Second World War, and the hustle and bustle there must have been in those areas in 1942. Thank you once more to the comments from listeners, and for your supportive emails. Can I say to Alistair, who will be listening to this on his mobile headphones as he cycles the hilly roads of North Island, New Zealand, I much appreciate the kind comments, and do keep the ideas of next events coming. I do have one amazing event coming up, and that is an Eventbrite Zoom pre-Christmas whisky and chocolate tasting and pairing with Scotland's top whisky guru Charles MacLean and Ian Burnett, the Highland chocolatier, whose dark chocolate truffle won Best Chocolate in the World. These old friends are going to join me at an early evening event on the 4th of December at 6:30 UK time to do a whisky and chocolate pairing and tasting. It's live and interactive, and when you sign up you'll be sent 4 5-centilitre bottles of fabulous whisky, a 12-year-old Bunnahabhain, 18-year-old Bowmore, 18-year-old Glengoyne and a 21-year-old Glendornoch. As well as that, you'll get a specially crafted box of Ian Burnett's best chocolates to taste and pair with Charlie's choice of whisky. It's going to be a fun and entertaining evening. And if you don't buy a ticket for yourself, then get one as a Christmas present for the one you love. It will be much appreciated. I have to say, however, this is only a UK event this time, due to considerable shipping and tax additions to send it abroad. I'm going to try to organise an event for outside the UK, so watch this space. For those in the UK who would wish to participate in this extraordinary event, then go to my website www.exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk, and on the home page you can click straight into the ticket page for this event. Please note the closing date is the 16th of November, so although the event is on the 4th of December, the closing date for buying a ticket is the 16th of November, and that takes into account the making of the chocolates, especially for the event, and shipping times. I'm actually going to start some live video touring, so watch out for that from my website as well. And just in case you've not found them, I do have some videos up on YouTube, and they can be found by searching Exclusive Scottish Visits. Well, I do hope you've enjoyed this week's podcast as much as I've enjoyed bringing it to you. Any comments are most welcome, and drop me a line using the contact page of my website. I always like to hear how and from where you listen to the podcast, so please do get in touch. I wish you continuing health and happiness, and during these very strange times, do keep up the morale and stay safe. As I record this, the US election result is still not confirmed, so I'll leave it there for now, but may the best man win. So, think happy thoughts, and I look forward to you joining me next time when I'll be bringing you the letter from Scotland, which will include opinion on the result of the US election, which should, it's hoped, be finalised by then. I send my very best wishes to you all, and I raise a glass in the traditional Scottish way, Slanjava.
This is the Unique Scotland podcast with exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk.